Welcome back to Just Liberty, friends, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, here with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of the very best magazine devoted to religious liberty, simply called Liberty Magazine. And today, our focus is on international religious freedom. Now, you may think that really religious freedom is all about what happens here at home. But I think most of us Americans see our country as a beacon of freedom for the world and appreciate the leadership that our nation has provided in, in pursuing globally values of freedom generally and religious freedom in particular. And our guest today is really one of the foremost leaders within international religious freedom circles. So, Bettina, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
We're so happy to have with us today on Just Liberty, Knox Thames, who is a leading human rights lawyer. He's an advocate who spent more than 2 decades defending religious freedom in various roles. I mean, he served in 3 U.S. administrations, including the State Department, where he was special advisor for religious minorities. And Knox now directs the Global Faith and Inclusive Societies program at Pepperdine University. He advises the U.S. Institute of Peace as well. He is the author of an excellent book, which I can't recommend highly enough. It's called Ending Persecution. And if you're interested in religious liberty advocacy in any capacity, that is a brilliant book to read. So welcome, Knox.
It's my pleasure to be back.
So, Knox, in a recent article that I read by you, you described international religious liberty advocacy as being at a perilous moment. What did you mean by that?
It's a kind of a word of warning. The caution lights are flashing yellow. I think those of us who care about religious freedom globally, that care about freedom of religion or belief for everyone, we need to be proactive in how we consider where we are as a movement so that things don't fall apart, but rather we can stabilize and move ahead. And it's a perilous moment because of the just dozens of global challenges that have emerged over the past decade. We have war in Europe and the Middle East. We've got most of the Western democracies, the political systems are in moments of turmoil. There's been a retrenchment to leave the values issues alone and to focus on hard policy issues. And this is leaving issues of human rights, issues of religious freedom very vulnerable to just being left in the lurch, being left behind. And that's going to have catastrophic implications for the persecuted, for those men and women who are wishing to pursue truth as their conscience leads without fear of discrimination or violence. They need governments and people of goodwill to be speaking up for them, to be advocating for them. And right now, the table we've set is shaky. And I was writing that article to put a warning light up that we need to be thinking proactively about how we stabilize so that we can meet this challenge and continue to build ahead.
Now, you've just referenced, the table that we've set, the systems we've put in place, the traditions we've built up around international religious liberty advocacy. I'm not sure that everyone is really aware of the, profound development in this area that's taken place over the past maybe decade. Can you describe sort of the high water mark of the international advocacy effort?
For the past decade, we've seen the growth of various networks trying to build a counterweight to this pandemic of persecution that's impacting every faith community somewhere. So what didn't exist 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, were networks of advocacy organizations committed to religious freedom for everyone. Many of them are representing their own faith communities. And so these networks, while they couldn't agree theologically on the time of day, they agree that people are invested with dignity, and that based on that common view of human dignity, we should advocate for people to have freedom of conscience. That network has led to networks of parliamentarians, networks of congressmen and elected officials working across political differences, across religious differences, across different regions of the world to, again, say we may have disagreements on tax rates, but we agree that people shouldn't be violently persecuted for their beliefs, and we're going to advocate for all. And that's also led to an alliance of countries that's 40 members strong now, stepping forward to say it's in our national interest to advocate for religious freedom for everyone. And it's not hyperbole to say that this is a first in human history to have governments and faith groups saying we're going to advocate for our own, but we're also going to advocate for the other and others in other countries. And we see that as a good that we want to pursue. So it's been a remarkable moment. Again, the challenge is still immense. We can't stop progressing in this effort. We can't applaud ourselves and say, well, this is great, we're done. We got to keep pushing ahead. But now I'm worried, actually, it's not a question of pushing ahead, it's a question of just stabilizing, because these other factors are pushing against these networks we've constructed that have been really a remarkable feat.
I mean, it really is an extraordinary moment in human history where we can rally around that idea of human freedom and use it as a sort of a unifying principle. Um, American foreign policy has also gone through a bit of um, a moment, not just recently, but also in the past couple of decades, with the creation of a number of organizations, institutions, entities that sort of help safeguard or, keep this momentum going. What are some of those institutions?
Well, the real turning point was over 25 years ago when Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, which President Bill Clinton signed into law, that established the protection and promotion of religious freedom abroad as a foreign policy priority of the United States. And to do this, it created a special office and a special ambassador at the State Department to lead these efforts. It also created a special commission that was part think tank, part watchdog to develop strategies for attacking these challenging issues. And then to give all of these tools some teeth, it created a special designation that the US government can levy against the worst persecutors of religious freedom. And so for the past quarter of a century, the US has been the global leader in advocating for religious freedom. And I think it's something as an American, and then the Americans who are tuning in, we should be incredibly proud of, that we have been carrying this fundamental American value forward in our foreign policy, unlike any other country ever has. Now, thankfully, these are established in law. So, administrations, Republican or Democratic, have to maintain them, have to continue to do this reporting. But the question is, how high up on the priority list will religious freedom fall? The first Trump administration raised it to unprecedented levels. They convened major summits. This alliance I mentioned was a Trump administration initiative. Since then, I've seen the commitment fade. The Biden administration did not maintain that high level of priority. And frankly, neither has the second Trump administration. And all of this in the context of now reduced aid budgets, which are helpful because so much of this work in advancing religious freedom is also equipping people who have suffered genocide, have suffered mass atrocities, to give them the tools to rebuild so they have a future in their ancestral homelands. I'm worried about these sort of seismic shifts in Washington with a walking away to humanitarian support, to values diplomacy, that we won't be the leader we have been in the past.
So where do we go from here? I mean, what do you foresee as you're looking, in the immediate months and maybe years ahead? What is the possible trajectory of what has been built up so carefully and painstakingly over the past couple of decades?
Well, we know the problem isn't going away. So that's going to be a constant, that this virus of religious persecution is going to continue to spread. People will continue to be harmed. The continue to be forced to literally run for their lives. And so the need isn't going away. If we ignore it, it's only going to get worse. And so there's a sort of a realpolitik argument for engaging issues of persecution, because if we don't, it unsettles communities, it leads to mass migration, it leads to growth in violent extremism and terrorism. So it's in our interests that we focus on these issues. But to steady these structures that have been created, I think it starts with, people like you and me in the United States or Western governments calling upon our elected leaders to say, hey, we care about this. And we're concerned that this issue is drifting down the priority list or even falling off altogether. And if you want our vote, if you want our support, we're going to ask that you focus on this. I think that's sort of the basic blocking and tackling of constituent advocacy that we need to kind of revive here in the U.S. I've seen a fading of interest in Congress. There aren't the champions that there used to be. And this is where faith communities are really important, that we educate our brothers and sisters in the pews that the issues of religious persecution are real, and we as a body of believers have a role in advocating for all. And this is where I've been a great friend of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because you all understand this, that it's religious freedom for all. And we may have theological disagreements, but because of our belief that God loves everyone and human dignity, we're advocating for all. And I have an effort we've started. We're going to try to make November 1st a day of prayer for everyone who's persecuted. This will precede the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, not to compete with that at all, but rather to say, before we start praying for brothers and sisters, let's pause and remember everyone who's suffering for their beliefs.
Right.
And that's great commandment. That's great commission. And I think these are the kinds of initiatives we need to double down on so that we have the support needed to keep these political structures intact.
Because that really is the building block of all of what you've just talked about, this principle that religious freedom doesn't inhere in someone because of their beliefs or their nationality or their culture, but simply because they are a human being.
Amen.
I want to ask you, you've been involved in this space for so long. You've traveled to so many different countries and worked at, the highest levels on these issues. Can you give us a sense of what the most pressing, most urgent areas of religious persecution are around the world today?
So I like to talk about 4 different types of persecution. When you talk about global persecution, it seems like this monolithic, monstrous problem. It is a monstrous problem, but I've tried to break it down into 4 different types. We can get our hand around it better, so we can devise strategies to address it. So the first type is authoritarian persecution. And this is what we see in China, what they're doing towards Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, to Christians, where the state just uses all of its power and weight to lock people up, bulldoze churches. So that's a type that is really open to, like, U.S. government diplomacy to push back against that. The second type is extremist persecution. And this is sort of the opposite. This is where people in a community, where mobs form, where people are beaten up, homes are burned down, places of worship are destroyed. This hatred of the other leads people to strike out. And so here you look at Pakistan or Sri Lanka, where we see these mobs attacking Muslims and Christians and others. The third type is persecution in a democracy, where a large religious community can use their numerical superiority to transform their beliefs at the ballot box into law. And so India is really a concern that I have to say here in the US, no administration wants to really understand what's happening. This growing Hindu chauvinistic nationalism that's having a devastating impact on religious minorities like Muslims and Christians. And then the third type is terrorism. So this is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, where fanatics are willing to use extreme violence to force their religious ideology over an entire country. And I think it's in failed and failing states where the church is the most vulnerable to terrorist attacks, where there aren't police to call, where there isn't a military to function to support them. So you see, like, northern Nigeria, the Boko Haram attacking churches. There's really no one the church can call, or in the Central African Republic, or in Pakistan, and these extremist attacks. because the church is everywhere, it's vulnerable everywhere. And since the church is often showing up in the failed and broken places of this world, their message of hope and peace and goodwill often makes them susceptible to attack by these extremists and terrorists.
I'm wondering whether our focus on religious liberty issues here in the US, I guess it tends toward navel gazing in a way, right? So I'm thinking of the current Religious Liberty Commission and a number of the high profile religious liberty issues that have sort of come to the fore over the past few months. The new guidelines for federal workers on religious expression in the workplace and so on. How easy is it to get sucked into that navel gazing and to just tune out, everything that you've described? I mean, what you've just described, the depths of human misery that encompasses is just mind blowing. And yet it's so easy for us to narrow religious liberty down to these very self-interested ideas.
It's a great point. And I think it's not to say these domestic debates aren't important.
Okay.
But I've joked that, I pray for the day that Pakistan is debating what bakers can make, what kind of cakes they can make. Like that would be a tremendous advance for Pakistan, where the issues I'm following there are people being murdered, people being beaten to death, being sent out on death row for what they believe. So it's just, we do a disservice to the issue of religious freedom if we make these sort of false comparisons between the challenges of living in a secularizing America that may be hostile to people of orthodox beliefs in family and contraception and other issues like that, with the violence that people risk every day when they simply want to pursue truth as their conscience leads. And I really believe, I've seen a lot of the world, that a bad day in the United States still beats a good day just about anywhere else. And we need to understand, our discussions in the context of the global picture. But at the same time, like these issues, the issues of persecution are so constant, so depressing, they're almost easy to tune out for sort of the
Right.
average person who doesn't do this professionally. And the local news feeds is hyping these domestic things. And so, of course, you're sort of led to see them as the most important issue. And it's the issue that touches you. But the more we can have a global perspective and not draw false equivalencies and still say, well, I may disagree with my neighbors on religious liberty policies here in the US, we can agree, right, left, and center, that people shouldn't be killed or attacked or jailed for what they believe. And so far, that's holding, and that's good. But the issue is just fading. And so it's not getting the attention it deserves.
I wonder also if part of the problem is that we are losing a sense of pride, maybe, or understanding of just how extraordinary the past 250 years have been. I mean, this is just a tiny blip in the historical record of the type of persecution, oppression, and violence which has marked any sort of dissident community through history. Yet here we have in America, just the most incredible record of fostering pluralistic societies. But we've lost our sense of how unique that is and how, extraordinary it is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. And I think as we forget that, or we're not aware of that, it makes these issues that are the finer points of religious liberty seem like existential crises. And then that just feeds, there are people on both sides that are conflict entrepreneurs, and they, if they get clicks, they make money. And I think we've got to wise up to say, it takes more effort now to be an informed citizen, because, I try to read, stuff right and left to try to triangulate, okay, what is actually the truth? And it's really hard, as we're all experiencing in this brave new world that we're in of social media. But there are people who benefit from conflict, and we need to understand that. And as Christians, be, slow to speak and quick to listen and understand what's happening, and then try to have a wise word to speak into that situation.
I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you about something else you've also written about, which are the protection of sacred sites, sacred heritage sites. Because when you think of religious liberty and advancing that, you don't necessarily, your mind doesn't immediately go to, well, we must protect religious heritage sites. What's the connection there?
Well, for, I grew up Baptist. We are of an ilk that you can pray anywhere, you can worship anywhere. But for other expressions of Christianity, especially Catholic and Orthodox, place really matters. And so if they have churches that go back hundreds of years, thousands of years as a place of spiritual significance, if they're destroyed by terrorists or hostile governments, or if they're just falling down because of time, these communities, their ability to worship is severely impacted. And that's also true for other faiths, Jews, Muslims, Hindus. And so that's sort of an overlooked part of protecting religious freedom is ensuring that these sacred places continue to exist, to continue to function. And I've also been exploring, how do we use these historic sacred sites as a place to foster positive pluralism?
Okay.
So like my trips to the Middle East, it's a Muslim majority region, but in Iraq, there are old synagogues, there are old churches, there are old Zoroastrian fire temples that are hints towards a past diversity that no longer exists. And so we've been exploring, how do we use a country's own history of diversity through these physical reminders of it, these historic sacred sites, to foster conversations about living together today in diversity. So it's not me as an American diplomat coming in holding the UN document on human rights. It's rather coming in humbly to listen, to learn, to ask questions, and to try to spark conversations about, okay, there's an old synagogue here, but there are no more Jews here. Why is that? What does that mean today? And we see potential here, and we're hoping to find a next grant to give us the funding to explore this with some activities in the field.
Because that kind of meets one of the frequent criticisms that international religious freedom advocacy sometimes gets, which is this is a Western value and it's mediated through Western language, through the through the language of international law. And yet here you're linking these concepts directly, culture within their own culture.
Yeah, and it's taking their stories, the good, but also the bad, and exploring what happened, why it happened, and where do we go from here. There is, throughout time, immortal, this trend of when the conqueror took over a country, when religion and state were fused, they would build their sacred site on top of the conquered sacred site. And so there's layers of history. And so starting to unpack that can help us think about how do we live together today in diversity. We talked about firsts in global human history. I think we're in another global first in that everybody's everywhere. People of different faiths, backgrounds, and cultures are intermixing as never before in human history. And so how we equip our communities to deal with that diversity is going to help us ensure that 21st century isn't one of death and destruction and conflict like the 20th century was. And it's going to be hard, but it's going to take us to be proactive, sort of faith forward in building relationships with others who we may have theological disagreements with, but again, we agree in human dignity for all, and we're going to work together towards that.
And that is a beautiful place, I think, to leave the interview. But can I just ask you before we finish up, talking to individuals who may be listening who say, I really want to get involved in something like this, in supporting these efforts. Can they do anything? What can they do?
Well, for your Adventist listeners, there's a lot of options with your church, with the International Religious Liberty Association, that have been real leaders in this fight for religious freedom for all. We've also created a network called Christians Against All Persecution.
Mhm.
So if you go to capnetwork.org, CAAP network.org, you can find resources for church groups, read about a conference we have coming up in Dallas next month. And we're going to explore the role of Christians in advocating for anyone facing persecution. And we'll soon be launching this Bible study for November 1st, Prayer for All the Persecuted Days. So those are some simple ways Christians can get involved, but then also it's just let your congressman know, let your senator know that you care about this. Get your church engaged in a way that's saying we want to see the United States continue to be that voice for the persecuted, because it's in our interest, but it also reflects our values. It reflects who we are as Americans, and it's important that our elected officials continue to hear that message.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll be checking out that website as well for those resources. Thank you so much, Knox. Really appreciate your time.
Now it's my pleasure.
So, Bettina, even for Americans who are paying attention to the fact that, this administration's approach to tariffs and foreign policy generally, is a change from, past practices, the ending of funding for U.S. aid, for example. I doubt very much that folks have given much thought to the implications for international religious freedom. So I'm really thankful for this opportunity to kind of shine a spotlight on Knox's work and his perspectives.
It's interesting, Alan, because before coming to Liberty Magazine, I actually worked in this space in international religious liberty advocacy in Washington, D.C. So much of what Knox was talking about, this collaboration between civil society groups such as, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which I represented at the time, and government, and the State Department, these collaborations were actually producing incredible results around the world. And you're right, it's not an area of work which many people are familiar with. But what we were doing in Washington, D.C., we were starting to replicate in capitals around the world where civil society was coming together with government to focus on advocacy for religious freedom within that local context. And this was happening in countries in Africa, in places in Asia, and so on. When you start to get the sort of reversals that we've seen in recent months, it really takes some momentum out of these efforts. And I'm frankly concerned about the direction that we're going in presently.
Thinking back to before the election in years past during the Biden years, conservatives would on occasion, engage with me very critically about what they called, the global order or the new world order or whatever, and so, as I would think about their concerns and take them seriously, I'd be like, well, okay, so yeah, there's a certain kind of global oligarchy maybe that, has an enormous amount of power and influence. Even assuming that the basic narrative is true, the question is, what do you want to replace it with? And, so what we're seeing, and the question that I would ask is, okay, so do you want a new global order where, Russia and China dominate the global order? That doesn't look very attractive to me. Well, as it happens today, I think that, the stars are shining for Russia and China. They're growing in power and influence, and it has not been favorable for American global leadership. But our focus here is not so much the broader implications of all this, but the fact that collateral damage, religious freedom is collateral damage, and the changes mean, whether you like them or not, there are changes in the global order.
Yeah. I think there's an argument to be made, Alan, from history that this nation was always envisioned as a nation that would be an example to the world, that would lead the world on issues of liberty. You see that reflected in the writings of the founders. You see it, it's always imperfectly reflected in policies and foreign policies. That's just a given. But I think the overarching narrative has been one of, we do want to lead the world. We do have something significant to share with the world on this issue of liberty and human rights. And in ceding that ground, I think we're losing a vital part of who we are as a nation.
So I have to comment on the irony of how this has come about, okay, Bettina, because during the Bush era, I was reading widely among the far left critics of American power, something called the American Empire Project. And they were very critical of, American imperialism and throwing our weight around and, talking about, for example, the blowback, the unintended consequences of withdrawing support for the Shah of Iran, and look what's happened with relations with Iran and the terrorism and what have you. So, the historic criticism of the global order and the American empire has come from the left, and yet the dramatic transformation of America's role in the global order is not come from the left, it's come from the right. And the right is not the one that has adapted the narrative of, well, our founding fathers were hypocrites because they talked about freedom while owning slaves, and looking at all of the mistreatment of racial and religious minorities and immigrants and all. That narrative has come from the left, right? The critique of, well, America says we want to project freedom and democracy around the world, but really we just want to exercise power. So that sort of cynicism and criticism has been the criticism from the left. But here it is, the right now, that is really, pursuing dramatic changes. And, the jury's still not out. We're still in process, but the transformation of the American empire is coming from the right, not from the left. So I just find that very, very ironic.
So, and I think it's a reminder to us that the issue of religious liberty is one that should definitely transcend left and right.
Correct.
It is a principle that is above politics. And I think when we enmesh it in our politics, we are doing it a disservice. So that's what this program is all about, Alan.
It is.
Get people to understand that regardless of their political leanings and persuasions, religious liberty is something above and beyond.
Amen to that. And on that note, we will see you next time here at Just Liberty. And always remember, eternal vigilance remains the price of liberty. So be informed, get involved.